OK, shall we get on with getting on and speak to our very first guest, the wonderful, inimitable Andrew Fox, defence expert, former paratrooper and research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society of Foreign Affairs think tank. Andrew, great to have you back on the programme. It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was your Christmas show last time. You were all done up like Santa. So, yeah, it's been a good month off.
Well, less so now. I'm sort of, I don't know, sort of grey and miserable looking today. Much like the weather outside, I'm toning in. OK, let's just get straight to this. What are your thoughts on what Trump had to say about his long phone conversation with Vladimir Putin? Trump made clear from the beginning he wants to go for peace, essentially. He wants to end that war, saying that the talks to end that war could start immediately, and saying that, of course, Zelensky is invited to those talks. Is this a good idea? Is this appeasement?
Yes, it is. It's absolutely appeasement. It's another great example of how Mr. Trump's transactional style on the world stage just doesn't take into account second and third order effects. And I find it deeply curious that he's prepared to bully Canada and Mexico with threats of tariffs. And yet the Russians seem to get away with a free pass. I find that a very curious element of Mr. Trump's style. Overall, I think it's very gracious and generous of him that he should invite Mr. Zelensky to peace talks. Very thoughtful. But I have deep concerns about the second and third order effects here and where Europe goes, particularly from a security perspective from this point onwards.
Now, I was sent a clip from somebody today pointing out Nigel Farage had said, well, look, if this is going to be the negotiation, he is, of course, a dear friend of Donald Trump. Perhaps the solution is that in return, Ukraine immediately becomes a member of NATO. Let's have a listen to that clip, actually.
I don't want to prejudge how these negotiations go, but I would have thought that if we're going to get Putin into a place and Zelensky into a place where we could have a reasonable negotiation, I would have thought, looking ahead, it's probably essential that Ukraine joins NATO. That's going to need to be part of this negotiation.
I mean, does that soften it a little bit? Let's imagine that in this negotiation, they say to Trump, right, you get Donbass. Not Trump. Trump says to Putin, right, you get Donbass, that's it. And he says to Zelensky, and you get to join NATO. I mean, at the end of the day, it has become a war of attrition. And this has been grinding on now for a number of years at the cost of billions of pounds, stroke dollars, stroke euros, stroke whatever. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, probably close to 1 million lives, actually. And, well, everyone wants to see some sort of resolution. And it seems to me Putin's probably not going to say, OK, I'll just stop and I don't want anything. Like, how do we build that golden bridge towards peace?
Yeah, and we can track back over the last 3 years and look at the litany of mistakes and errors of judgment that have been made, not arming Ukraine enough or fast enough. The Ukrainians themselves making a mess of their big summer offensive. And now here we are, as you say, in a war of attrition where Ukraine, frankly, as things stand, can't win. So in terms of wanting peace, they don't really have a huge amount of choice. When it comes to what Russia are going to be offered, it's going to take a huge amount of incentive for them not to try and stay in Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, and keep all of those regions, having successfully taken them from the Ukrainians. And I suspect the corollary to getting them to withdraw from anywhere will be that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. Much as I'm a fan of the idea, I think that will be a red line for Putin when it comes to signing any kind of a deal. And so we're looking at a far more dangerous situation of not only European peacekeepers on the ground without the umbrella of NATO Article 5 to protect them should Russia recommence hostilities. But we also have now serious questions over the whole future of NATO if this doesn't happen. If we can't rely on America, is there any point in NATO? And it's it's going to be a really big security question for European leaders to answer, both in terms of how they cooperate with each other going forward and how much they spend on defence.
I mean, is there a possibility, though, that because I had heard from someone who's a very close friend of Donald Trump, and I'm not talking about Mr. Farage, talking about somebody else who happens to be one of Trump's best friends, who said to me in confidence, look, don't get me wrong, he's on the side of Ukraine. He is not on the side of Putin. He's very much on the side of Ukraine, but he also wants to be remembered for peace and wants this to come to an end. Could there be a possibility that, that they may not be able to keep what would be strategically vital coastal positions in terms of controlling ports. We've seen how that was war-gamed a lot during this particular war. The control of fertilizer, wheat, all coming out of the south coast of Ukraine, which caused, in a large part, global inflation. But perhaps they do manage to, you know, hold on to the Russian language part of Ukraine, the far east bits, the Donbass and the like. And then perhaps there could be some sort of military pact between America and Ukraine where Trump then says to Putin, right, you have that, but you do anything else and we're going to be on to you. We're not going to hold back. Is that possible?
I mean, yes, but it wouldn't make a great deal of sense. Because if that's the case, well, why isn't America weighing in on Ukraine's side now? Why haven't we seen NATO air power in the skies to wipe the Russians off the battlefield, which would be the inevitable result of us chipping in fully on the side of Ukraine? So the idea that you can say we're not going to back you now whilst you're in the middle of a war, but we will back you in future should that war restart seems to ring a bit hollow to me. And I think Mr. Trump's not on Ukraine's side. He's not on Russia's side. He's on the America First agenda side. He's on Donald Trump's side. And my great concern about that, this kind of withdrawal from American security commitments, is that this has happened twice before in history, and both times we've ended up in a world war. So when we look back over history and the precedent, this kind of appeasement approach to dictatorships and authoritarian states has led to in the past. You know, I think this is worrying, and I think it is a bad thing for Europe and the world more generally. We've got to think about what this means for China as well. They will see us placating authoritarian dictatorships, and they have very well articulated designs on Taiwan. Which is clearly also under the American security umbrella. So the knock-on effect of placating Putin right now could lead to even more conflict further down the line.
I mean, I think Donald Trump has been very clear that he wants his legacy of being that of peace. He wants to be the person who sort of has statues made as the great diplomat and being able to strong-arm other sort of, you know, tough-talking world leaders into backing down and getting his own way for the greater good of the world. Do you think the Europeans are going to be able to convince him that actually standing up to Putin and throwing US weight behind Ukraine would be the solution? Because it's been a bit of a sort of a divisive electoral issue over in America. Many of the Republican Party are pretty much against wading in and helping out Ukraine. And we've both sort of said it is already a war of attrition. When someone asks me my opinion on this, I just say I really don't know anymore. What I do know is I don't think that Putin should be able to have much at all, if anything. But I don't know how to make the man stop.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect this is kind of already done. I think Mr. Trump will already have a very good idea of what Vladimir Putin will accept in exchange for a ceasefire, and we all have to wait and see what happens. But yes, of course, Trump does see himself as this peacemaker. But if we look at how his deals over the last 4 years of Trump and how the current ones are going, it simply shows that whilst authoritarian states are playing chess, Mr. Trump is playing hungry hippos. He isn't in the game at all. We look at the Abraham Accords that disregarded Palestinian statehood and led us directly to 7th of October. We look at the peace deal that he negotiated in Doha with the Taliban that led to essentially a withdrawal and a complete surrender to the Taliban and a complete abandonment of Afghanistan and our allies. We look at what he's doing in Gaza now, where he's simply making the situation more complicated with heavy-handed threats that are putting Hamas into a corner where it reduces the chance of peace and hostages being released. You know, this kind of blundering transactional approach that he takes has time and time again backfired because he hasn't looked at what might come next. And that's my biggest fear, that he's going to repeat that pattern in Ukraine.
What do you think does need to be done? I mean, in an ideal world, would it essentially be NATO going into Ukraine, going above Russia, and essentially potentially starting a big conflict?
Well, that's the issue. And I think we can't undo the mistakes of the last 2 years. And that's what's led us to this point where we are today, where Ukraine is going to have to make concessions. It doesn't mean that I'm particularly happy about it, but unfortunately there are a chain of events that have led us to this point. But I do think perhaps the threat of force is something that Putin might understand. He seems to be of that strongman mentality where he respects force and he respects power. But what I don't think is right is a ceasefire deal under any circumstances whatsoever. So we don't know the details yet, as Mr. Farage said in the clip you just played. We don't want to situate this and try and assume that we know how the outcome's going to go. But we do need to be, I think, very careful about giving Putin too much so that he can claim some kind of a victory in Ukraine.
The problem is Putin's going to, say he's been victorious, whatever, isn't he? He's not going to turn around and say, I lost this one. I think that's not part of his sort of egocentric personality. Pete Hegseth talking at the NATO summit in Brussels. Top line that I'm seeing is he's essentially saying that Europe has to spend more on defence. I mean, that's fair, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is, actually, because only 8 countries in NATO are failing to make the 2% that they've promised. Those are countries like Spain, Italy, and Slovakia. They, even if they made 2%, it wouldn't be a huge contribution to the overall effort any more than it really is now. And the really obvious point here is that nobody else has the spending power of America. It is the world's only global superpower. It spends more on defense than the next 10 countries put together. We cannot expect Europe, which is not doing well economically, to suddenly find trillions of dollars to try and replace the security umbrella that America has promised and has given us since 1945. So yeah, you can say people aren't spending enough, but when we're talking about percentages, it's a tiny percentage. It's a tiny overall whole, so 2% is a tiny amount. When we talk about America, 2% is an enormous amount of money. So we can't really, I don't think, expect European nations to spend money they don't have. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do more, and it certainly means, I certainly think that we should do more, particularly in the UK, where our armed forces are in an absolutely parlous state, and Poland give us a really good model of how to modernise and grow your armed forces to a size that make them meaningful. But to say that we should somehow try and find a parity with the United States just isn't going to happen.
Do you think we've got a bit of a problem in Europe that we always expect America to want to run in and help us? First World War, Second World War. We expect the United States, because they're essentially our cousins. It was, a landmass that was then inhabited by Brits and Dutch and so on and so forth. We kind of expect them to want to come and help us, and yet we're always a little bit dismayed when it takes them a long time to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, both those occasions, World War I and World War II, as I alluded to, were preceded by periods of this American isolationism that we're about to see again under Donald Trump. So that's a concern for me. But there's a very kind of a very obvious point to make here, and that is that America has been hugely enriched by the security umbrella that it's given the world. It's not out of the goodness of their hearts. It's not out of generosity or the fact that nobody else would do it. If we look at that real boom period in America, the 1950s and 60s, that was almost entirely due to trade and the fact that the world was buying American products, was investing in America because the world had the freedom to do so, empowered by an American security blanket as the world's dominant benign superpower versus a malign superpower in the USSR. So it's not as if America isn't getting anything from making the world a more peaceful, a better protected place, because they have, profited from that enormously.
Just a small aside here. I've just come back from Gloucestershire. I've been a couple of days where I hail from, and reading the local press there's all sorts of, twitchers and plane spotters who lurk around looking at all the great machines going into military air bases. And one of the big headlines I read was that US Air Force bombers have been flown into various air bases in that neck of the woods, but these aren't for routine exercises, and this has been preceded by various other smaller planes, which are the ones who sort of carry payloads or whatnot to furnish the big bombers, things like the B-52s, if they go out on active duty. Can we read anything into that?
I mean, I don't have enough detail on that to really make a comment. I mean, there are certain things around the world I can see happening. Potentially a strike on Iran has been talked about. They are weaker than they have been in 20 years. If we're going to get rid of their nukes, then now is probably the time. Whether it is a good move or not, I'm not sure, because, again, second and third order effects. What happens if we do that? We need to really game that through and make sure we've properly understood the ramifications. Maybe it's for the threat that I talked about, where they might threaten to flex NATO air power against Putin should he not agree to a ceasefire deal. It's possible, but this is all just conjecture at this stage. Those are the only two real fronts that I can see air power of that size and scale being used right now.
Yeah, how this plays out is anyone's guess. Andrew Fox, always great having you on. Thank you so much for your expert opinion.